Story 1: The Creepy Cabin of Pine Hollow. A terrifying tale of twin sisters who entered and barely escaped in a small, fog-covered town hidden deep within the dense pines of Pine Hollow. There stood an abandoned, eerie cabin. Locals whispered about its tragic history, a place of disappearances and shadows, avoided by nearly everyone in the area. But for twin sisters Lena and Riley, curiosity overpowered caution. They'd heard the rumors at school, where classmates dared each other to step inside. The cabin was supposed to be haunted by something ancient and vengeful. As the sisters crept through the woods that night, with only the moonlight filtering through the branches, their hearts pounded with both fear and excitement. As soon as they reached the cabin, an uneasy silence enveloped them. The air felt thick, damp, and somehow charged. Lena hesitated, noticing how dark the windows were, like empty eyes staring back. But Riley, the braver of the two, gently pushed the door, which creaked open slowly, almost as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. The cold air made their skin prickle, and each step sent eerie echoes across the room. The girls held their breath as they explored the shadowed corners, feeling as if someone, or something, was watching their every move. And then they heard it, a faint whisper, as if coming from just beyond the walls. "Did you hear that?" Lena's voice was barely audible, her face pale with fear. They listened, hearts hammering, and the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Get out!" The words froze them in place. Riley grabbed Lena's hand, ready to bolt, but as they turned, they saw it. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light, slipping across the far wall. It was tall, with long, claw-like hands, and seemed to float just above the ground. The figure didn't move toward them, but it seemed to shift and pulse, as if feeding on their fear. Panicking, they backed up, knocking into a small wooden table that toppled with a loud crash. Echoing in the silence, the shadow seemed to react, flickering and growing darker. They could feel it closing in, the room chilling further as the figure's low growl filled the air. The walls seemed to breathe, as if the house itself was alive, trapping them in its icy grip. With a sudden surge of courage, Lena grabbed her sister's hand, pulling her toward the door. They stumbled outside, barely able to breathe as they tore through the trees, branches snagging their clothes and scratching their faces. Behind them, a faint whisper echoed through the woods one last time, chilling them to the bone. "Come back." The sisters never spoke of what they'd seen that night. Not to each other, not to anyone, but whenever they passed by those shadowed woods, they'd feel the same cold shiver, as if the haunted cabin was calling them, waiting, longing for their return. Story 2: The Echoing Shadows of Hallway 13. A chilling encounter in the abandoned school bathroom. Every town has its legends, and in the sleepy, windswept town of Reading, there was an old high school with an infamous reputation. The eerie tales centered around Hallway 13, a narrow, forgotten corridor leading to a restroom that had been abandoned years ago after a terrible accident. No one knew the details, but students whispered about how strange sounds and ghostly sightings plagued anyone who dared to enter. One rainy afternoon, Jenny, a new transfer student, was struggling to find a restroom. She stumbled upon Hallway 13, dim and nearly hidden from sight. The rain was pouring, thunder rumbling outside, and the main bathroom was locked. Though every instinct screamed to turn back, she was in a hurry, and the silence of Hallway 13 seemed welcoming compared to the storm outside. As she entered, the The dim, flickering lights gave the restroom an eerie, hazy glow. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell, like old pipes mixed with something sour. She thought she heard faint footsteps behind her, but dismissed it, assuming it was the rain echoing in the empty hallway. Jenny hurried into one of the stalls, shutting the door with a creak. But as soon as she was inside, an unsettling sensation washed over her. She felt as though someone, or something, was watching. She glanced under the stall, expecting to see feet, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded harder with each passing second, but she tried to calm herself, attributing the eerie feeling to her nerves and the room's dismal lighting. Then, the lights began to flicker more erratically, plunging the room into darkness before blinking back on. Shadows danced across the restroom walls, their shapes twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. One shadow in particular caught her eye. It was tall, with distorted features, and it seemed to be moving closer. A faint whisper echoed around her, barely above a murmur. "Get out." Jenny froze, her skin crawling. She was now sure she wasn't alone. She could hear faint, irregular breathing, but no footsteps, no movement other than the flickering lights and shifting shadows. She tried to calm herself, rationalizing that maybe it was just an electrical fault. But the whispers continued, filling her with a creeping dread that tightened her chest. When she finally gathered the courage to leave the stall, she moved quickly, desperate to reach the door. But as she caught a glimpse of the restroom mirror, her blood turned cold. Reflected behind her was a figure, tall, dark, and looming. Its face was twisted, with hollow eyes and a wide, twisted smile, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. With a scream, Jenny bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she reached the main hallway. Breathless and pale, she tried to explain what she'd seen, but her words faltered, her mind still gripped by the horror she'd just experienced. Since that night, Jenny never ventured near hallway 13 again, and the few students who dared visit reported the same feeling, a presence lurking, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to wander in. Story 3. A Deadly Confession. How two backpackers uncovered the sinister secret of a criminal kingpin. It was supposed to be an adventure of a lifetime for Evan and Sarah, two friends fresh out of college, backpacking across remote regions of South America. The culture, the mountains, the hidden villages, they wanted to experience it all, but what they didn't know was that one seemingly innocent encounter would lead them into the dark world of a powerful criminal, leaving them changed forever. Their troubles began when they reached San Miguel, a small, bustling town nestled deep in the mountains. A local man known as Don Victor offered them a room in his large, rustic villa at the edge of town. He seemed generous, his charm disarming, and he offered them wine and stories of the town's history. But as the evening wore on, his tales grew darker, hinting at his shadowy past. Evan and Sarah laughed it off, attributing his mysterious air to the late hour and too much wine. But when Don Victor invited them on a tour of his estate the next day, they couldn't resist the offer. The next morning, as they wandered through the villa, Don Victor took them to an underground wine cellar that seemed older than the house itself. Flickering lights illuminated rows of wine barrels, creating long shadows that danced eerily on the damp stone walls. As they moved deeper into the cellar, they noticed something odd, a heavy, locked metal door with no apparent handle. Evan's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked, "What's behind there?" Don Victor's expression shifted, his smile fading as his eyes darkened. He motioned them closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What I'm about to tell you," he murmured, "is not something you can ever share." The tension was palpable as Don Victor recounted his story. He revealed that years ago, he had been one of the most feared drug lords in South America, his empire spanning continents. But it wasn't the drugs or money that fueled his power. It was something far more sinister. Behind that metal door was a room where he had made countless sacrifices to a dark figure he called El Hombre de la Sombra, the Man of Shadows. He claimed that these rituals were what brought him fortune and protection, binding his empire to something unearthly. Evan and Sarah's eyes widened in horror as Don Victor continued, his voice steady but chillingly cold. He spoke of the people he had brought into that room, never to be seen again. The sacrifices, he said, were the true reason for his continued influence. Even though he had long since retired, he laughed as he noted how even now, locals were still terrified of crossing him. Realizing the danger they were in, Evan and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. They were trapped in the cellar with a man who had just confessed to horrors they could barely comprehend. And then, Don Victor's gaze turned to them, a sinister glint in his eyes. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You're safe for now," he said, a cruel smile on his lips, "as long as you never speak of this." The two friends stumbled back, murmuring promises to keep his secret as they made their way back up to the surface. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to escape the villa as quickly as possible. They managed to get to the village square, their minds reeling, and boarded the first bus out of San Miguel without looking back. It wasn't until they were miles away that they finally spoke, still haunted by the darkness they'd left behind. And while they eventually went their separate ways, neither Evan nor Sarah ever truly escaped that night. Both lived with the shadow of Don Victor's secrets, forever haunted by what lay behind that locked door. Story 4: The Shadow at My Window. A terrifying true encounter that still haunts me. It was during my junior year of high school when I moved into a small, old rental house on the edge of town with my mom. The neighborhood was quiet and mostly empty. With streetlights that barely worked and an eerie stillness that blanketed the streets after sunset. The first few nights were peaceful, and I figured the silence would be perfect for studying. But then, the strange events started. It began innocently enough. I'd be studying in my room when I'd hear a faint knock at the window, always around midnight. At first, I thought it'd be just the wind rattling the glass, but the knocking was rhythmic. 3 soft taps, then silence, as if someone were testing whether I'd noticed. I checked the window a few times, but each time, there was nothing there but darkness. I chalked it up to my imagination, probably fueled by my late-night study sessions. But then, I started noticing subtle shadows moving across my curtains, even though no one else was home. Sometimes, it felt as if something were standing just outside, watching. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was all just in my head. But each night, the knocks returned, growing louder and more persistent. One particularly cold night, I heard not only the knocks, but also a strange scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers down the glass. My heart pounded as I forced myself to glance at the window. Nothing was there, but the shadow lingered, growing darker and more defined, almost as if it were taunting me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and waited for it to disappear. But when I opened my eyes again, I felt a chill race down my spine. The shadow seemed to be pressing closer to the window, taking shape. The next day I tried to tell my mom, but she brushed it off as stress. That night, I pulled the blinds down, hoping it would make me feel safer. But around midnight, the tapping returned, followed by a whisper so faint it was almost inaudible. It was calling my name. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and quickly snapped a photo through a tiny gap in the blinds, hoping to capture whatever was out there. When I looked at the image, my blood went cold. There was a faint outline of a figure standing inches from the glass, a tall, shadowy form with hollow eyes, its face twisted in an expression I couldn't decipher. It felt like it was looking straight through me. Terrified, I stayed up all night with the lights on, but the tapping continued until dawn. I avoided my room after dark from then on, only sleeping in the living room where the lights and TV drowned out any sounds. Eventually, the visits stopped, and I managed to convince myself it had been some sort of elaborate prank or just stress playing tricks on me. But every so often, I'd hear that soft tapping again, even if just faintly, and on the nights I heard it, I'd feel that same dread, the overwhelming feeling of being watched by something that still lingered, waiting for me to return to that window. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel.